Chapter 14. "Oh my!" 3PO gasped, just audibly. "We're doomed." Karrde looked back around. Behind Shada, the three thugs 3PO had just identified were striding between the tables towards them, blasters now in their hands as well. Across the rest of the Tap Cafe, the casual drinkers and loungers were either staring in surprise or morbid anticipation, or else trying to beat a surreptitious retreat before the shooting started. "I suppose it would be a waste of breath to say you have the wrong people," he said, turning back to face the men behind him. "No, go right ahead," the thug's spokesman said sarcastically as the three of them got to their feet and fanned out slightly to cover their targets. "I always enjoy a good laugh in the morning. Hands on the table, please. So, did I catch the name right? Talon Karrde?" "Yes, indeed." Antony spoke up brightly before Karrde could answer. "And this is Shada, and their protocol droid, C-3PO." The spokesman impaled the little man with a glare. "You with them?" Antony's eyes widened innocently. "Me? Not really, sir." "Then get out of here." Antony blinked, threw a quick look around at Shada and Karrde, and scrambled up from his seat. "Do let me know, Captain Karrde, if you change your mind," he said. He shot a quick smile at Karrde, another at the spokesman, then bounced his way towards the door. The spokesman watched him go, frowning, and as the little man pulled open the door, he turned back to face Karrde. "Change your mind about what?" he demanded as the thud of the closing door echoed across the Tap Cafe. "He'd just made me an interesting offer," Karrde said, lifting his arms with conspicuous slowness and folding them across his chest. The thugs, their full attention on him and Shada, had completely missed the fact that someone had come into the Tap Cafe at the same moment Antony left. If he could manage to keep all of their attention on him for just a few more seconds. And then someone across the room swore in astonishment. One of the thugs glanced around. "Shri! Zern!" he barked. The spokesman spun around and froze, his mouth dropping open with shock. Silently, determinedly, Hishishi was striding towards them. It took Zern another second to find his voice. "What in the name of the rift is that?" he breathed. "She's a Togorian," Karrde supplied, throwing a surreptitious glance at Shada. Her eyes were darting back and forth between the suddenly inattentive thugs, clearly measuring distances and assessing possibilities. That could be trouble. "Oh, and she's with me," he added. Hishishi was still coming towards the semicircle of thugs, her mouth open far enough to show her fangs. "Tell it to stop!" Zern snapped, his voice hitting a higher pitch as his blaster jerked around to point at the Togorian. "You hear me? Tell it to stop or we'll shoot!" "I wouldn't advise shooting a Togorian," Karrde admonished him mildly. "It only makes him angry." Zern shot a look of disbelief towards him, and in that instant, Shada moved. Her left hand, resting casually near her mug, snatched it up, and with a quick flick of her forearm, she hurled the contents across the table, squarely into Zern's face. He bellowed, throwing up his forearm too late to try to block the wave of liquid. A convulsive jerk the other direction, and Shada had hurled the mug itself with crushing force into the throat of one of the other thugs. She started to leap up, yelping under her breath as Karrde grabbed her arm and held her firmly in her seat. There was the sputter of blaster fire and the sounds of bodies hitting the floor. "Lower your weapon, Zern," Karrde said quietly. Even to his own ears, his voice seemed a startling intrusion into the sudden taut silence filling the Tap Cafe. Very slowly, very carefully. Zern gave his eyes one last swipe with his sleeve and blinked them open. And for the second time in half a minute he appeared to be struck speechless as he stared at the scene around him in stunned disbelief. Disbelief at Karrde and Shada sitting unhurt at the table. Disbelief at the crumpled bodies of his men lying around him on the floor, wisps of noxious smoke rising from the blaster wounds riddling their bodies. And disbelief at the four crush-hide-clad men at various tables scattered around the Tap Cafe pointing blasters at him. Your blaster's urn, Card prompted again as the thug continued to gape, drops of Shada's drink dripping rhythmically off his chin. Shada stirred, but before she could move, Hisaishi had stepped up to Zern's side and engulfed the barrel of his blaster in one massive hand. He started, almost as if seeing the Tagorian for the first time, as she twisted the weapon to point harmlessly at the ceiling. She raised her other hand and dug a claw delicately into the back of his wrist, and this time he finally let go. Well done, everyone, Card said, getting to his feet as Hisaishi stepped back, the blaster now reversed, ready in her hand. Dankin? Here, the familiar voice came from a distinctly unfamiliar face as the other stood up at his table. Go give the bartender something to compensate for the mess, Card instructed him. It's somewhat traditional in these cases, he added to Zern as Dankin crossed towards the bar, digging into his pocket. Griv, stand by the door. Chow, Balig, go front guard the way back to the ship. Right. The other three headed for the door. You're cute, Zern spat viciously. Real cute. But if you think this is going to get you out from under Rikasa's hammer, you're crazy. If I were you, I'd worry more about what Rikas will do for you losing your mob this way, Card countered. I'd also worry about getting out of here before Hisaishi decides you're too dangerous to leave alive. Oh, I'll leave, Zern said darkly. But you'll see me again, Card. Just before you die. With one final glare, he turned and stomped out of the tap cafe. Well, Card said, turning back to Shada and holding out a hand to her. She didn't move. So you had backups in place all along, she said, looking up at him. There was something distinctly discomforting in her voice and face. I thought you said you wouldn't take that as an insult, Card reminded her carefully. They're in disguise, she said. Slowly, Card lowered his hand to his side. They were all seen by the local inspectors who searched the ship earlier, he explained. I had to assume some of the group were spies for the pirates and would be able to recognize them. And the Crush hide outfits? Mara brought them back from her trip here, Card said, starting to feel sweat breaking out on his forehead. Shada rose to her feet. And you didn't think, she said quietly, that I could be trusted with it. For a second, Card couldn't find his voice. The deep ache that had been in Shada's voice was so completely unexpected. No, that's not it, he said. I didn't. But it was too late. She had already turned her back on him and was striding towards the door where Grev stood guard. Are the repairs finished yet? She asked. Grev shot a quick look over his shoulder at Card. Close enough, he said cautiously. Good, she said, stepping past him and pulling the door open. Looks clear, she announced. Let's get back to the ship. Griv looked questioningly at Card again. Yes, he muttered, heading towards the door. The walk back to the wild card was very quiet. Shada had stripped off her jumpsuit and had just gotten into her robe when the cabin door call chimed. Who is it? She called. It's Card, the other's voice came distantly through the panel. May I come in? Shada sighed, wrapping her robe securely around her and knotting the waist sash. She had no particular desire to see him, especially right now. But she had committed herself to this trip, and she couldn't very well avoid the captain and still fulfill that commitment. Besides, the pain of his casual betrayal of her trust had almost subsided. Enough, anyway. Come in, she called, tapping the release. The door slid open and Card stepped inside. We've just made the jump to light speed, he told her, taking in her state of dress and dismissing it in a single glance. O'Donnell estimates 7 days to Exocron. Good, Shada said briskly. I should be back to full combat capability by then. Speaking of which, if you'll excuse me, I'm on my way to the Bacta tank. The Bacta can wait, Card said politely, but firmly, gesturing her to a chair. I'd like to talk to you. She thought about refusing, but she was still committed to him and to this trip. About what? She said, sitting down, wondering if he was really insensitive enough to try concocting some feeble excuse about that tap cafe thing at this late date. But he surprised her. George Cardass, of course, he said, pulling another chair over to face her and sitting down. It's time you heard the whole story. Really, she said, keeping her voice neutral. He'd only promised to tell her this story on the way into the exochron system, which, according to him, was still a week away. Was this his way of trying to make amends for his earlier thoughtlessness? Not that it mattered. Too little too late, but at least she'd get some useful information out of it. Go on, she said. His gaze drifted outward as if to a time or place far away. The story of George Cardass goes back about 60 years, he said, to the Clone Wars era and the chaos that it brought on the galaxy. There was a great need for smuggling during the conflict and afterward, of necessities as well as contraband, and a large number of organizations were hastily and rather haphazardly thrown together. That was when the Hutts really hit their stride, wasn't it? Shada asked, interest stirring in spite of herself. There was very little she knew about that period, and she'd always wanted to know more. Many of them did, yes, Karrde said. Cardass was one of those who jumped into the business, and whether through skill or simple blind luck, wound up with one of the better organizations. Not one of the larger ones, but definitely one of the better ones. They'd been operating for about 15 years when he was accidentally caught up in the middle of a big battle between the Biphashi Dark Jedi and, well, basically everyone else in that sector. According to Cardass's later story, one of the Dark Jedi commandeered his private ship and forced them to take off. Shada shivered. That one she did know something about. A group of Mistral had been involved on the defensive side of that conflict. Some of the stories she'd heard as a child from the survivors had given her nightmares. I'm surprised he came back to tell anyone any stories at all, she said. So was everyone else, Karrde said. The other 4 members of his crew never did return, in fact, but Cardass did. He suddenly reappeared 2 months later, settled back into control of his organization, and to all appearances, life went back to normal. But the appearances were wrong. Very wrong, Karrde agreed soberly. It was quickly apparent to his inner circle that something serious had happened to him during those 2 months. He still had one of the biggest smuggling groups around, but suddenly he began pushing to make it one of the biggest as well. He would move systematically into the territories of smaller groups and either buy them, absorb them, or destroy them, taking over their routes and clientele. Unlike the Hutts and other groups, he went for overall coverage rather than concentrated brute force control, spreading himself thinly out over rather than trying to dominate any specific systems or sectors. In a few years, he was already on his way to having something that could someday rival even Jabba's organization. Didn't anyone try to stop him? Shada asked. I can't see the Hutts sitting by and letting him outflank them that way. My dear Shada, everyone tried to stop him, Karrde said darkly. But he was almost literally unstoppable. Somewhere, somehow, he had developed a knack for guessing precisely what his opponents were planning against him, and he was often able to counter their attacks almost literally before they were launched. Shada thought back to the dozens of missions she'd gone on for the Mistral, and the hours of painstaking research she'd had to put into learning her opponent's strengths and weaknesses, weapons and strategies, allies and opponents. A handy talent, she murmured. Extremely handy, Karrde agreed. But even as his organization grew, Cardass himself began to change. He became, I don't know, moody perhaps, inclined to flashes of screaming rage over little things that shouldn't have bothered him at all, or brooding alone for hours on end over charts of the Empire. More significantly, perhaps, after years of vigorous youth, he seemed to be aging rapidly, much faster than one would have thought normal or likely. And then one day, he got into his private ship, took off, and vanished. Shada frowned. Vanished? You mean vanished? I mean disappeared from the known galaxy, Karrde said. He didn't go near any of his people, didn't contact any of his chief lieutenants, and if he was ever seen again by any of his enemies, they never announced that fact. When was this? Shada asked. 20 years ago, Card said. At first there wasn't too much concern. He'd gone off on occasional secret trips before. But after 3 months had gone by and he still hadn't surfaced, his lieutenants began to talk about what they should do if he didn't come back. Let me guess, Shada said. They wanted to hold a vote and see which of them would take over. I don't think voting was the procedure any of them had in mind, Card said ruefully. In fact, the threat of violence was so thick that the suggestion was made that we simply split up the organization and each take a chunk. The trick being how to divide it to everyone's satisfaction, Shada said, noting the telltale word with interest. It was the first time in his recitation that Card had used the word we. So we wound up with a power struggle anyway. Card's lips pressed briefly together. Not exactly. I saw what would happen in that kind of struggle, and I wasn't totally convinced that Karrde wouldn't be coming back. So I took over. Shada lifted her eyebrows slightly. Just like that? He shrugged uncomfortably. More or less. It took planning and timing, of course, and a fair amount of luck, though I don't think I realized quite how much until I looked back on it from a distance of a few years. But yes, basically, just like that. I neutralized the other lieutenants and moved them out, and announced to the rest of the organization that it was henceforth to be business as usual. I bet that made you very popular, Shada said. But I seem to be missing the problem here, at least as far as Karrde is concerned. He left and never came back, right? The problem, Card said heavily, is that I'm not sure he didn't. Shada held her eyes narrow. Oh? I took over the organization in a single night, Card said. But that doesn't mean there weren't attempts by the ousted lieutenants and their cadres afterward to drive me out and take over themselves. There were 8 different attempts, in fact, ranging from 2 immediate and abortive tries to an intricate scheme 3 years later that had probably taken the conspirators that entire time to plan. All of which failed, obviously. Card nodded. The point is that the leaders of 4 of those plots claimed during their interrogations that Karrde had been secretly behind them. Shada snorted under her breath. Smoke covers, she said scornfully, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. Just trying to rattle you into cutting a deal. That was my conclusion at the time, Card said. But of course, there was no way for me to be sure. Still isn't, for that matter. I suppose not. Shada studied his face. So what happened 6 years ago that made you and Jade and Calrissian out here to look for him? It started farther back than that, Card said. 10 years ago, actually, just after Grand Admiral Thrawn died. His lip twitched. Or perhaps merely faked his death. I was on Coruscant helping set up the Smugglers Alliance, and Calrissian happened to show me something Luke Skywalker had found buried on a planet called Dagobah. Shada searched her memory. I don't think I've ever heard of the place. No reason why you should have, Card said. There's absolutely nothing there. No cities, no technology, no colonies. What Skywalker wanted with the swamps, I don't know, but it was obvious that stray electronic devices were out of place, which is probably why he brought it back. At any rate, from the markings, I recognized it as the beacon call from Karrde's personal ship. Really, Shada said, frowning. A beacon call was the control for a fully slave-rigged ship, one that could operate on complete remote control whenever its owner signaled for it. The Mistral never used full-rigged ships themselves, but she'd occasionally ridden on one with a client. Overall, they gave her the creeps. Karrde had a full-rigged ship, did he? A pre-Clone Wars vintage, yes, Card said. He bought it soon after he returned from that bout with the Dark Jedi. Said he wanted a decently sized ship that he could fly alone, without the need for a crew. And Skywalker just happened to find his beacon call lying in the mud on some deserted planet. How convenient. That was my thought too, Card said. But I checked with Skywalker, and the discovery seemed entirely fortuitous. Though whether that word can be applied to Jedi has always been arguable, Shada put in. True, Card conceded. Still, it was the first clue we'd had in the decade, and even if it was some kind of plant, I thought it was worth the risk of seeing where it led. So you sent Jade to hunt him down, Shada said, remembering the conversation she'd overheard back in the Solo's Orrowood Tower apartment. And Calrissian insisted on tagging along. Basically, Card said. They started at Dagobah and worked their way outward, searching through old spaceport records for where he might have stopped off for repairs or refueling. They also dug up hints about him here and there, some from the Coruscant Library, some from various fringe characters, some from Corellian security of all places, and started putting the pieces together. Talk about your lifetime jobs, Shada murmured. It wasn't quite that bad, but it did definitely take some years, Card said. Especially as they both kept getting dragged off on other business or pulled in to help fix whatever Coruscant's crisis of the month was. Still, the trail was already so cold that a month or two here or there didn't make much of a difference. They kept at it until they wound up in Cathal Sector, an Exocron. And there, as far as we can tell, the trail ends. For a moment, the room was silent as Shada digested it all. I take it they never actually saw Karrde himself? With a visible effort, Card seemed to draw himself back from whatever ghosts of the past he was gazing at. They had explicit instructions not to, he said. They were to find out where he was, and with a world as well hidden as Exocron, they also needed to find a route into the place. And then they were to come home. I would take it from there. And this was how long ago? Card shrugged uncomfortably. A few years. So what happened? To be honest, I lost my nerve, he admitted. After what I'd done, I wasn't at all sure how I was going to face him. Had no idea what I was going to say, how I was going to even try to make amends. So I kept finding excuses to put it off. He took a deep breath. And now it looks like I'm too late. Shada grimaced. You think Rekas is working for him? Rekas, possibly Mombasa, probably a dozen others we haven't even heard about, Card said heavily. But he's definitely on the move. Only this time he seems to be concentrating on piracy and slaving instead of smuggling and information brokering. The more violent edge of the fringe, and I can only see one reason why he would do that. To come after me. Personally. For a moment the words seemed to hang in the air like a death mark. I don't think that necessarily follows, Shada said into the silence, moved by some obscure desire to argue the point. Why can't he just be building up a force to carve himself a little empire here in this backwater? Take over Exocron, maybe, or even this little so-called Cathal Republic. He's been here for nearly 2 decades, Shada, Card reminded her. If he was into empire carving, don't you think he would have done it before now? If he was into taking you out, don't you think he would have done that before now, too? Shada countered. He may have already tried. And then what? Given up after the first 3 years? Card shook his head. It doesn't make sense to me either, he conceded. But I knew Karrde, and he wasn't the sort of person who could just sit around doing nothing. He was a ruthless man, hard and calculating, who never forgave a wrong against him and never let anyone or anything stand in the way of what he wanted. And he lived for challenges. The bigger, the better. And he knows I'm here, and that I'm looking for him. That little man, Antuni, is all the proof we need of that. An involuntary shiver ran through Shada. The wild card, which had felt so safe and secure up till now, suddenly felt small and very vulnerable. And so here we are, walking straight into his hands. You at least should have nothing to fear from him, Card assured her. You're not connected in any way with me or my organization. He hesitated. As a matter of fact, that's why I agreed to let you come along. Shada stared at him as understanding suddenly slapped her like an ice-soaked rag. You're expecting him to kill you, aren't you? She breathed. And you think... You're not associated with me, Shada, Card said quietly. Everyone else aboard the ship is. I would have come alone, but I knew I couldn't survive the trip to Exocron in anything smaller or less well armed than the wild card. Kardas is a vengeful man, but like Bombasa, he likes to consider himself cultured. I hope to talk him out of killing me, of course. I hope even more that he won't harm my crew. But if he's adamant on settling old scores, I hope at least I can persuade him to let you go back to the New Republic with a copy of the Kamas document. Shada shook her head. Karrde, this is insane. At any rate, that's the whole story, he cut her off easily, standing up and swinging his chair back to where it had been. Oh, except for the fact that the huge data library Cardass has built up over the years vanished along with him, which is why we think he may have a copy of the Kamas document. And now, you do need to get to that Bacta tank. I'll see you later. With a nod, he left. Karrde, this is insane, Shada repeated again, quietly, to the empty room. It was only later, floating in the Bacta tank, that the other part of it occurred to her. Karrde was hoping, he had said, that Cardass would allow her to leave. But he wasn't guaranteeing it. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.